As Margaret Thompson drove through the upscale suburban neighborhood outside Chicago, her thoughts turned to her daughter. It had been 2 weeks since her last phone call with Emily. Her daughter, who used to call almost daily, now only had brief conversations a few times a month. She told herself it was because Emily was busy with work, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Emily, how are you doing?" Margaret had asked during their phone call last month. Her daughter's voice had been bright, but there was something tired about it. "Oh, I'm fine, Mom. Work's been busy, but fulfilling." "That's good to hear. How about we have lunch sometime? Just the two of us, like old times." "I'll call you back, Mom. Daniel's coming home." These types of conversations had become the norm. Her daughter had married Daniel Mitchell 3 years ago and lived in a luxurious house in the Chicago suburbs. Her husband, who worked as a manager at an IT company, was wealthy and publicly declared his love for Emily. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect marriage. Margaret parked her car in front of her daughter's house. The pristine white exterior with black window frames and meticulously maintained garden looked like something straight out of a magazine. All the houses in this neighborhood had that same picture-perfect beauty. Yet somehow, Margaret felt a knot of anxiety in her chest. When she rang the doorbell, the door opened after a moment. The instant Emily appeared, Margaret caught her breath. Her daughter looked much thinner than before. She was dressed in an expensive-looking navy dress, her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was flawless. But that very perfection felt unnaturally forced. "Mom. I've missed you so much." Emily spread her arms wide to welcome her mother. Her voice was certainly bright, but it seemed somewhat theatrical. In college, her daughter had shown a more natural, carefree smile. "What a lovely home," Margaret said as she entered the living room. High ceilings, a chandelier, leather sofas, a fireplace, everything was expensive and coordinated. "Daniel chose everything. He has good taste, doesn't he?" There was pride in Emily's voice, but it also sounded somehow detached, as if she were talking about someone else's life. "What about your opinion?" When Margaret asked, Emily showed a momentarily confused expression. "Me? I'm fine with anything. I trust Daniel's choices." Just then, footsteps could be heard from the kitchen, and Daniel appeared. He wore a shirt and slacks, with a perfect smile on his face. He had strong facial features and spoke in a refined manner. Just looking at his appearance, he seemed like an ideal husband. "It's been a while. Emily has been wanting to see you," Daniel said in a warm voice. However, the moment his hand was placed on Emily's shoulder, Margaret didn't miss how her daughter's body tensed slightly. It was only for an instant, but it looked as if she had reflexively braced herself. "Daniel, thank you for your hard work," Margaret returned the greeting. "How's work going?" "It's going well, thanks to you. I need to work even harder to make Emily happy," he said while gazing at his wife. That gaze seemed loving, but there was also something sharp about it, like surveillance. The three sat in the living room, continuing their conversation over tea. Daniel was talkative, speaking in detail about work and local matters. Emily occasionally nodded and smiled, but she rarely spoke herself. The daughter from before had been chatty and genuinely enjoyed conversations with her mother. The sense of unease in Margaret's chest grew stronger. Her daughter's smile seemed unnatural, her gaze restless. She occasionally glanced toward Daniel in a way that seemed cautious. She was like a completely different person from the bright, free-spirited daughter of—
Can you imagine making $10,000 a month just from YouTube, all from home? That's exactly what I did with Reddit stories. No face, no voice. Check the link in the description if you're curious.
the past. Something was happening in this seemingly perfect house. Her maternal instincts were sending her warnings. "Have you been seeing friends lately?" Margaret asked as she set down her teacup. She didn't miss how Emily's expression momentarily clouded. "Oh, everyone's so busy," Emily answered vaguely, clasping her hands together on her lap. And life has changed since I got married. What about Jessica? Your best friend from college. You used to keep in touch with her all the time. Margaret gently prompted. Jessica Collins had been Emily's closest friend since college. The two used to meet weekly and could talk about anything. She moved away. Far away, Emily's voice became smaller. At that moment, Daniel interjected. Emily has me now. She doesn't need friends, right? He spoke in a joking tone, but there was something heavy in those words. Emily just smiled and said nothing. Margaret felt alarm bells going off in her chest. In a healthy marriage, it was unthinkable for a spouse to dismiss friendships. But Emily didn't argue with Daniel's words. It was as if she had become accustomed to not doing so. Let me help with dinner, Margaret stood up. Let's stand in the kitchen together, like old times. Emily showed a pleased expression. Yes, Mom. Let's cook together for the first time in a while. The kitchen was equipped with the latest appliances. Marble countertops, stainless steel commercial-grade range, a huge refrigerator. Yet somehow it lacked the feeling of being lived in. It had a showroom-like perfection, seeming to lack human warmth. When Emily began cutting cabbage, Margaret noticed her daughter's hands were shaking. The hand holding the knife was trembling slightly but unmistakably. Are you okay? Are you tired? Margaret asked with concern. No, I'm fine, Emily answered quickly, but her voice was slightly strained. I've been a little sleep-deprived lately. Just then, Emily's smartphone on the counter chimed with a message notification. The moment she saw the screen, Emily's face went pale. The color drained from her face completely. Who's it from? Margaret asked casually. Daniel. He says he'll be home soon, Emily's voice was trembling. But he's in the living room. No, he went back to work. To get some documents, Emily explained frantically. He's coming back now. Margaret was confused. She hadn't noticed Daniel leaving at all. But Emily's panic was more concerning. Why would her husband's return home cause such anxiety? Emily's movements suddenly became hurried. She sped up cutting vegetables and began frantically taking out seasonings. As if she were racing against time. Emily, there's no need to rush like that. But I have to finish preparing before Daniel gets back. Sweat was beading on Emily's forehead. He expects a perfect dinner. A perfect dinner. Margaret frowned. Home cooking is enough if it's made with love. Emily stopped and looked at her mother. There was something she seemed to want to say in her eyes. But she quickly looked away and began cutting vegetables again. Suddenly, Emily's hand slipped. A white plate fell to the floor, shattering with a loud crash. Pieces scattered in all directions. I'm sorry. I'll clean it up right away. Emily went into a panic. Her voice cracked and her face turned pale. It was as if the end of the world had come. Wait, you'll hurt yourself, Margaret tried to stop her daughter when the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. I'm home. What was that noise? Daniel's voice could be heard from the hallway. It had a low, intimidating tone. The plate. Emily's voice was shaking. She knelt on the floor, trying to pick up the pieces with her bare hands. Like a child who had committed a crime. Daniel appeared in the kitchen. The first thing his eyes took in was the scattered pieces on the floor and his wife trying to pick them up. Margaret tensed. She watched with bated breath to see how he would react. However, contrary to expectations, Daniel showed a gentle expression. It's okay, Emily. It's just a plate. He spoke in a calm voice, took Emily's hands and helped her stand up. Then he got out a broom and dustpan and began carefully cleaning up the pieces. From the outside, he looked like a perfectly understanding husband. I'm sorry, mother-in-law. Emily seems tired lately, Daniel said apologetically. It must be stress from work. Oh no, don't worry about it, Margaret replied, but the unease in her heart was growing. Emily's reaction had been far too extreme. Why would she become so upset over breaking just one plate? But what was more concerning was Emily's expression. Despite her husband's kind words and actions, she wasn't relieved. Rather, she was trembling slightly. As if she were afraid of the calm before the storm. Shall I help with dinner preparation? Daniel suggested. No, it's fine, Emily answered quickly. It'll be ready soon. I see. But don't overdo it, Daniel lightly kissed his wife's cheek. It was the gesture of a loving husband. But Margaret didn't miss it. In that moment, Emily reflexively stiffened. After Daniel returned to the living room, a heavy silence filled the kitchen. Emily continued cooking silently, but her hands were still shaking. Emily, Margaret called out quietly. Is something? Nothing's wrong, Mom, Emily answered without turning around. Really, nothing's wrong. But the tremor in her voice told the whole story. Something was happening to her daughter in this seemingly perfect house. Margaret's maternal instincts were now turning into certainty. Dinner proceeded peacefully on the surface. Daniel was talkative, speaking in detail about work success stories and local topics. The roast chicken and salad that Emily made were delicious, and the table setting was perfect. But for Margaret, this meal was one of the most uncomfortable she'd ever experienced. Emily was quiet throughout. While her husband spoke, she smiled and nodded, but rarely spoke up herself. The daughter from before would have been chatting enthusiastically about recent events and memories during a long-awaited meal with her mother. Emily's cooking has really improved, hasn't it? Daniel said proudly. Since getting married, she's become such a good wife. Yes, it's very delicious, Margaret answered while looking at her daughter. But Emily wouldn't meet her gaze. As if she were afraid to look into her mother's eyes. My strict guidance paid off, Daniel said jokingly, but those words made Margaret freeze. The choice of the word, guidance, felt inappropriate. In a marital relationship, it wasn't healthy for one party to guide the other. Emily put down her fork and said, I'll get some water, standing up. Her movement seemed hurried. She looked like she wanted to escape from the conversation. The moment Daniel and Margaret were alone, his expression changed slightly. His perfect smile remained unchanged, but there was a coldness in his eyes. Mother-in-law, if you have any concerns about Emily, please don't hesitate to talk to me, Daniel said in a low voice. I know my wife better than anyone. Those words seemed to contain an implicit warning. As if he were saying, don't pry into things that don't concern you. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. When Emily returned, Daniel's expression returned to that of the perfect husband. You must be getting tired, mother-in-law. You probably have an early day tomorrow. Looking at the clock, it was only 8 p.m. Usually, Margaret and her daughter would spend much longer together. But in this atmosphere, it was certainly difficult to stay longer. Yes, I should probably head home, Margaret stood up. As she put on her shoes at the entrance, the evening light streaming in from outside illuminated Emily's face from the side. In that moment, Margaret gasped. She could see a faint purple bruise on her daughter's left cheek. She had tried to hide it with foundation, but the angled light revealed it clearly. Furthermore, there were unnatural color changes on her neck. They looked like marks from someone gripping or strangling her. Emily, your face. Margaret reached out just as Daniel quickly stepped between them. Oh, that? Daniel smiled wryly. Actually, she fell down the stairs last week. She's really clumsy, my wife. Down the stairs. Margaret's voice was shaking. That's right, Mom. I'm really careless, Emily quickly agreed. But there was no conviction in her voice. It sounded like she was reciting memorized lines. Margaret recalled her knowledge from years of working as a librarian with medical books. The location of the bruises was clearly different from what would result from falling downstairs. The bruise on her cheek looked more like it came from a slap than a fall. The marks on her neck closely resembled those made when someone grabs or strangles you. "You need to be more careful," Margaret said, trying to maintain her composure. But her heart was pounding violently. "Yes, I'll be more careful next time," Emily smiled slightly, but fear dwelt in her eyes. As Margaret put on her coat, she carefully observed her daughter's condition. Emily's hands were shaking, she occasionally glanced toward Daniel, and tension ran through her entire body. Everything was abnormal. "Well, drive carefully, Mom," Emily hugged Margaret. It was a long-awaited mother-daughter embrace. In that moment, Margaret felt something slip into her coat pocket. Something very small, like a piece of paper. Emily's body trembled strongly for an instant. Then, next to Margaret's ear, in a voice so small it was almost inaudible, she whispered, "Don't let him notice." That voice was filled with despair and fear. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly once more. She said nothing, but tried to convey that she had definitely received her daughter's message. "Come visit again, Mom," Emily said in a normal voice. But for an instant, her eyes held a desperate light. As if they were screaming, "Please, help me." "Yes, I will," Margaret answered. Those words contained a promise to her daughter. Daniel was watching from behind, waving with a perfect smile. "Take care. Please come visit again soon." Margaret walked toward her car. Feeling Daniel's gaze on her back, she tried to act as naturally as possible. She opened the car door, sat in the seat, and started the engine. Daniel and Emily were still standing at the entrance, waving. The picture of a perfect couple. Margaret waved back and slowly started the car. She maintained a natural speed until she turned the corner and her daughter's house was out of sight. But her heart continued to pound violently. After putting sufficient distance between them, Margaret pulled over to the side of the road. With trembling hands, she reached into her coat pocket. Her fingertips touched a small, folded piece of paper. Under the streetlight, she carefully opened the paper. Words that seemed to have been written hastily with shaking hands appeared. "Help me." Margaret's hands shook violently. She gripped the paper tightly so it wouldn't blow away in the wind. Her daughter, her beloved daughter, was asking for help. This small note told the story of Emily's desperate situation. The shakiness of the writing, the way the paper was folded, everything expressed her daughter's fear. This wasn't something written in a planned way. It was probably written hurriedly when she went to the bathroom or had a moment alone in the kitchen. In a situation where discovery could lead to unknown consequences. Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks. At the same time, anger burned in her chest. Anger toward the man who was hurting her daughter, and anger at herself for not noticing until now. In the car, Margaret took out her cell phone. She almost called Emily but stopped herself. Daniel was likely nearby. Calling might put her daughter in even more danger. Instead, Margaret took a deep breath. She couldn't panic. She needed to act calmly now. She needed to move strategically to save her daughter. But one thing was certain. She couldn't leave her daughter alone anymore. By any means necessary, she had to rescue Emily from that house, from that man. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep at all. She looked at her daughter's note over and over and kept thinking about the bruises on Emily's face. Near dawn, she finally made up her mind. She would consult with the police first. The next morning, Margaret went to the local police station. When she explained the situation at the reception desk, a young officer assisted her. However, his response was far from what she had hoped for. "So you believe your daughter is being subjected to violence by her husband," the officer confirmed in a businesslike tone. "Do you have any concrete evidence?" This note, Margaret offered the piece of paper with trembling hands. And I saw bruises on my daughter's face. The officer glanced at the note and returned it to Margaret. I'm sorry, but this alone is insufficient as evidence. Reports of domestic violence require a complaint from the victim herself. Or we would need clear photographs of injuries, a doctor's diagnosis, etc. But my daughter is afraid. She's not in a situation where she can report it herself, Margaret pleaded desperately. I understand your feelings, but legally, confirming the victim's own will is the top priority. If she's really in a dangerous situation, please persuade your daughter to contact us herself. The officer's words were logical, but they sounded hopeless to Margaret. Blocked by institutional barriers, she couldn't help her daughter. This would mean the violence would continue until Emily could seek help herself. Leaving the police station, Margaret considered her next move. She needed to gather evidence. And she needed to understand the situation that was isolating Emily. She would try contacting her daughter's friends. However, she didn't have contact information for Jessica Collins, Emily's best friend. Margaret checked her old address book, but Jessica's information was from college days and was likely no longer current. Contact information for other friends was similarly outdated. She remembered the names of friends invited to the wedding but didn't know how to reach them specifically. It was as if Emily's social connections had been intentionally severed. Margaret decided to check social media. She found Emily's Facebook account, but the last post was over a year ago. Before that, she had frequently posted photos with friends and updates about her life, but after marriage, posts gradually decreased and eventually stopped completely. Her Instagram account was the same. The last post was a photo from her wedding with Daniel. After that, no updates at all. It was as if Emily had disappeared from the internet. This isn't a coincidence, Margaret was certain. She's being deliberately isolated. Using the investigative skills she had developed over years as a librarian, Margaret decided to approach from a different angle. She would research Daniel Mitchell. His work history, past relationships. She might find some clues. Searching the internet, she found information about Tech Solutions Chicago, where Daniel worked. It was a medium-sized IT company, and Daniel worked there as a project manager. The company website featured his photo and a brief profile. Further research revealed information about Daniel's previous job. Until 3 years ago, he had worked at a company called Innovative Systems. Margaret mustered the courage to call that company. Innovative Systems, a receptionist answered. Excuse me, I'd like to ask about Daniel Mitchell, who used to work there. I'm sorry, but we can't provide information about former employees. Actually, he's my daughter's husband. Margaret explained in a troubled tone. I have some family concerns. After a moment of silence, the receptionist said quietly, Please hold on. I'll transfer you to Mark Johnson, our manager. A few minutes later, a man's voice came on the line. This is Johnson. I understand you're inquiring about Daniel Mitchell. Yes. I'm Margaret Thompson. I'm Daniel's wife's mother. I see, Mark's voice was cautious. What would you like to know? About his character, if you know anything. I'm a bit worried about my daughter. Over the phone, she could tell Mark was hesitating. But eventually he spoke. Daniel Mitchell. Yes, I remember him. He was an excellent employee. Technically, he was flawless. Technically, meaning. Personally, he was a bit. Mark seemed to be choosing his words carefully. He had controlling tendencies. There were some problems with his relationships with female colleagues. Margaret's heart began racing. What kind of problems? At the time, he was dating a woman in the company. Rebecca Stone. But he extremely disliked her talking to other male colleagues and monitored her behavior even at work. He checked her emails and schedule and restricted even who she had lunch with. Margaret gasped. This was clearly abnormal behavior. What happened to Rebecca? She eventually changed jobs. Before leaving, she came to HR for consultation. She said Daniel's behavior was too controlling and she was mentally exhausted. Mark's voice became heavy. Actually, I spoke with her. Daniel was completely managing his girlfriend's behavior. He prohibited contact with friends and restricted meetings with family. In Margaret's mind, all the dots connected. It was exactly the same as Emily's situation. Severing relationships with friends, reducing contact with family, social isolation. Daniel had done the same thing before. Can you still contact Rebecca? I'm sorry, but I don't know her current contact information. However, Mark hesitated. If your daughter is in a similar situation, I recommend consulting with specialized agencies. Daniel's behavior pattern was typical of a controlling partner. After hanging up, Margaret couldn't stop shaking. She now understood the severity of the situation her daughter was in. This wasn't isolated violence. It was planned and ongoing control and abuse. Even more frightening, Daniel had repeated the same pattern before. And while Rebecca had been able to escape through changing jobs, Emily was bound by the legal constraints of marriage. Escaping would be far more difficult. Margaret looked up the phone number for a domestic violence support center. She needed professional advice. When she called, an experienced counselor assisted her. From what you've described, your daughter is definitely a victim of domestic violence, the counselor stated firmly. Isolation, monitoring, physical violence. It's a typical pattern. And the fact that the perpetrator had shown similar behavior before indicates this is a character issue. How can I help my daughter? First, it's important for the victim to recognize their situation and have the will to seek help. However, it can take time to reach that point. Victims feel fear toward the perpetrator while also having a dependency relationship. But my daughter is asking for help. With a note. That's a good sign. However, there may still be psychological barriers before actually taking action. What's important is that you continue to support her without giving up. The counselor gave her specific advice. Safe contact methods, shelter information, legal procedures. And most importantly, she emphasized not blaming the victim and not rushing them. After hanging up, Margaret steeled her resolve. No matter how long it took, she would save her daughter. For that, she needed trustworthy collaborators. Margaret contacted Robert Kemp, a longtime friend and former police officer. Robert had extensive experience handling domestic violence cases and continued volunteer victim support work after retirement. Margaret, that situation is definitely domestic violence, Robert stated firmly over the phone. You can't leave your daughter alone. You should visit the house again soon. I'll come with you this time. But won't Daniel become suspicious? That's fine. Having a third party present might actually restrain his behavior. And it will let your daughter know that external support exists. Margaret felt hope. She wasn't alone. She had trustworthy allies to help save her daughter. Tomorrow, she would visit Emily's house again. This time, to truly rescue her daughter. The next morning, Margaret visited Emily's house again with Robert. They had timed it for when Daniel would be away at work. Robert's experience as a police officer and calm judgment were reassuring to Margaret. Emily opened the door with a surprised expression. She looked even thinner than the day before, with dark circles under her eyes. Mom? Why are you so early? Emily, we need to talk. An important conversation. Margaret took her daughter's hands. This is Robert Kemp. He's an old friend of mine and someone who can help you. Robert greeted her with a gentle expression. Emily, your mother has told me about your situation. You're not alone. Confusion ran through Emily's eyes. What are you talking about? I haven't. About the note, Margaret said quietly. The note where you wrote, "Help me." In that moment, Emily's mask crumbled. Tears overflowed and her whole body began to shake. Mom. It's okay now. Come with us. Right now, Margaret embraced her daughter. Mom will protect you. But when Daniel comes home. Emily's voice shook with fear. When he gets angry, I don't know what he'll do. Before, when I tried to contact friends. You don't need to worry about that anymore, Robert said gently. We're going to take you to a safe place. Just get what you need and let's leave immediately. Emily hesitated but eventually nodded slightly. 3 years of fear and isolation were finally about to end. They quickly packed minimal belongings and the three left the house. In the car, Emily began telling the truth for the first time. He was kind at first. But after we got married, he gradually changed. He restricted contact with friends and reduced meetings with family. By the time I realized it, I couldn't ask anyone for help. Margaret and Robert took Emily to a women's protection shelter. There, for the first time, her daughter was able to tell everything in a safe environment. It started with verbal intimidation and gradually escalated to physical violence. Cell phone monitoring, restrictions on going out, economic control. All the typical patterns of domestic violence were present. Yesterday, that time I could meet with you, Mom, was my only chance, Emily tearfully recounted. If you hadn't noticed, I might have stayed in that hell forever. The shelter counselor helped Emily proceed with legal action. With Robert's testimony and the information Margaret had gathered, police moved forward with Daniel's arrest. His past behavioral patterns at work also became important evidence. 6 months later, Emily was gradually recovering. She received professional counseling, started a new life in a small apartment. She reunited with friends she had lost touch with and found work in graphic design. Most importantly, she had regained her authentic smile. Mom, thank you, Emily said to her mother during dinner one day. If you hadn't noticed, I think I'd still be in that cage. We're family. It's only natural, Margaret smiled. But you were the most courageous one. Because you gave me that note. Daniel received a guilty verdict and was receiving rehabilitation programs in prison. During the investigation, it was revealed that he himself had grown up witnessing domestic violence in childhood. To break the cycle of violence, treatment of perpetrators was also necessary. Margaret reflected. That small note, those words, "help me," had changed 2 people's lives. Sometimes, the most important messages arrive in the smallest forms. And she realized that family bonds mean having the courage to notice the small SOS signals from loved ones and extend a helping hand despite any difficulties.